The lands of Teyvat, as we've seen them thus far, are filled to the brim with deep-cut lore and mysteries. But the ruins found throughout the world are as varied as they are numerous, making it somewhat difficult to say with any clarity exactly who some of the ruins belong to. To help clarify the identity of these ruins, I've spent many countless hours comparing the architectural oddities of each over the past 2 years, but I've never dedicated any videos expressly to discussing those findings. So, in this video, I'm going to review my findings from all over the map, from the Chasm in Liyue to Inazuma and Mondstadt, sharing my take. I am doing this not only to reveal who I believe each must have belonged to, but also I'll discuss some of the most interesting and unusual discoveries or observations, one of which appears to point at another visit in the past from an unknown god we've not seen in 500 years. But first, I'm currently striving to reach the goal of 150,000 subscribers. So, whether you're new to the channel or you've watched lots of my videos but haven't subscribed yet, please support what I do by subscribing and help me beat the YouTube algorithm and reach my goal of 150,000 subscribers by the end of 2022. To start the video off, I feel it will be best to dive in by establishing the baseline of my understanding with regard to the ruins of Teyvat, and where my reasoning comes from for assigning identities to specific ruin sets. First, if one set of ruins displays unique architecture that is uniformly similar to those displayed in other ruins found in other locations around the map, then it can be reasonably assumed that it is Hoyoverse's intent to imply that those ruins originate from the same civilization, or they have a distant connection, as it is not generally normal for completely separate cultures and civilizations to develop identical architectural design elements and decorative themes in the absence of an outside influence. With that idea outlined, we begin with what is arguably the most important of the ruins we've seen around Teyvat, the ruins of Khaenri'ah. We've never expressly been told through the story that these ruins are in fact those of the ancient civilization which was destroyed 500 years ago. However, all the way back in the trailer which established so many of the ideas that we now take for granted, we will be reunited, we see Lumine drop to her knees, devastated over the destruction of what she now calls the homeland. We even learn from our own traveler that they too have memories of the destruction of Khaenri'ah from the period of time immediately preceding their encounter with the sustainer of heavenly principles. So, while it could be considered somewhat presumptive, we do have a fair amount of evidence which would suggest that the ruins in that trailer were previously the human nation of Khaenri'ah. And when we take a closer look, we can identify several forms that are still present all over the ruins scattered throughout every region we've visited so far. In fact, they're not just similar, they're identical. And as I stated earlier, that cannot be accidental. In keeping with this idea, I've long stated my belief that this scene actually took place poetically near our own traveler's starting location, on the outskirts of eastern Mondstadt, with the most common argument I've seen against this idea is that it appears to some to resemble the ruins of Stormterror's lair. The most frequent comparison I've seen described is the fallen walkpaths and arches all over the scene, which seem to resemble those of the Lord of Storm's former kingdom. But we can't properly identify the structure of those arches at all, however, due to the lack of detail in the image. But we can use one of the identifiable pillars as a means for comparing the architecture of the lair versus the Khaenri'ah ruins which exist outside of Old Mond. The stones which make up the walls and roads of Stormterror's lair are made up of fairly flat, clean-faced stones, whereas the stones from Khaenri'ah all appear to display an unusual pattern of scratched-in lines across most of their faces. And in some locations, those scratches even form familiar images. Additionally, the swirling and somewhat floral-themed decorative patterns of Decorabian's designs do not appear to match those that we see on ruins in any other area outside of this, particularly not within the very abundant Khaenri'ah ruins. The scaling of the scene also doesn't quite fit with Stormterror's lair, as even from the outermost edges of the area, the central tower is still quite tall, and in the current day it is not resting at an angle, which is further evidence that this cannot be Stormterror's lair. Even the archways which we see in Stormterror's lair appear not to be actual fallen arches in some cases, but rather intentional ramps to upper levels, as there is no rebel present nearby, nor receiving ends for the arches to have once connected to. Moving on, we have a great deal of ruins on Dragonspine, all of which match the patterns and design language of Khaenri'ah ruins. But this is where things begin to get complicated as I see it. These ruins gave us our first glimpse of the subterranean designs, which include large rounded doorways with 4-point insignias above them. Symbols also seen in the ruins of Surumi Island, which also appear to be of Khaenri'ah nature. But Surumi's placement in time seems to have been several thousand years ago, and around that time, Khaenri'ah's reach was still fairly unknown and said to be largely subterranean. But if that was the case, why did the ruins of Surumi, Salvandagnir on Dragonspine, and Khaenri'ah throughout Mondstadt, Liyue, and Inazuma all match without variance unless they are all linked somehow? The answer to this question could be revealed to us from the details of the scribe's box found in Salvandagnir's ruins, which states, "I've heard of a people who are building a new nation without gods. Perhaps they'll have the power to stand against this world." This seems to suggest that what few survivors managed to escape the wrath of the heavens upon the mountain fled into the northeast, into the newly revealed nation without a god, and shared their knowledge of architecture and design with the budding Khaenri'ahs at an influential and opportune moment in their development. After all, for them to flee down the mountain into the hills of Mondstadt would have been the intuitive and closest safe haven, and those reeling from the heavenly destruction might have instilled upon Khaenri'ah a mighty fear of the gods and a need to find a preventative power, which might allow them to claim a corner of Teyvat for themselves without a need for celestial approval. Here, I should note, the ruins I'm describing thus far as Khaenri'ah also appeared all over the Golden Apple Archipelago, a place once inhabited by those who hoped to escape Surumi Island and became ensnared within a similar fog, preventing their return to Surumi to aid the escape of others. It could be possible that some of those voyagers who were presumed to have escaped the archipelago in time managed to reach the shores of Mondstadt and founded Salvandagnir themselves, which might offer an explanation as to why the ruins of Surumi, Salvandagnir, and Khaenri'ah all appear the same. This would be because Khaenri'ah may have with open arms accepted the help of others from nations seeking refuge from the cruel gods in the heavens in their nation without a god. Next, I want to briefly touch on the ruins which appear in Liyue, as they have a design language of their own. These ruins represent the original Liyue, founded by both Morax and Guizhong, largely existing within the lands of the Guili Plains. Humanity was forced out of these lands during the Archon War by the miasma and other horrid creatures brought on by the slaying of competing gods. A curiosity of these ruins is where they too overlap somewhat with the ruins of Khaenri'ah design, particularly where the hidden ruins of Havria, the god of Assault's people, resided in their end times. Clearly, we can see that this gateway, which once sealed away the truth of her death, was created by Khaenri'ah. But I believe this design detail might begin to provide us with a motive for the sudden change of heart in Havria's people. In an era where those who supported gods who could not stand against the might and will of other gods were unlikely to survive, Khaenri'ah's nation without a god might have seemed an interesting and tempting salvation to ensure their survival. As such, the god of Salt's people may have been coerced by the supposed envoys of Khaenri'ah to assassinate their god as a form of mercy, relieving her of the burden of caring for scared or starving followers, and relieving the people of their weak but kind god, one which could not ensure their survival. The final deed done, Havria's power was released and the people's betrayal of their god was forever immortalized. Did the Khaenri'ahs seal off this location to ensure that no one would learn of the god's murder and that they were the influencers of the act itself? If so, it is ironic that the sealing structure they built to contain the horrors of their meddling is the very thing that correlates them with the crime. While we're on the subject of ruins in Liyue, the Chasm, as it turns out, contains a strong link to an ancient nation. But not Khaenri'ah, as it seems like on the first glance, with even Dane saying that ruins here may have belonged to a nation even more ancient than his own. And indeed, that is true. The design language and architecture of the ruins here match the ruins found in the depths of Enkanomiya. Everything from the statues to the bookshelves are a perfect one-to-one match, giving us a solid connection between these two locations. These ruins, then, must have a relationship to the ancient nation of Byakuyakuku, but these poor people may have suffered an even worse fate than that of their counterparts, banished to the deep abyss of Enkanomiya. Deep in the darkest corners of the chasm in the final chamber rests a celestial nail. seemingly identical to the one which severed Salvandagnir's connection to the ley lines, killed their sacred tree, and brought on an unending winter, which led to the slow death of the kingdom's inhabitants. What's truly curious here is the structure of the massive stone pillars all throughout the cavern. Pillars which appear to strike out in cube-like formations in every direction. Here they swirl inwards, as if they were tightening their grip in pursuit of escaping victims. The pattern appears again at the maw, or mouth of the chasm. These cubes undeniably evoke the imagery of the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles' attacks against our traveler and their sibling as they frantically attempted to keep their heads above water in a fight in which they were hopelessly outmatched. Here, in the scene of Khaenri'ah's destruction, we can see the cubes of the Sustainer's magic moving inwards towards the molten lava in the center of the ruins. Was the chasm another site of magma and death? Are the cube-like pillars the now solidified and unfortunate soul snares of Byakuyakuku's above-ground remnants? For now, it remains a mystery. With the ruins from Mondstadt, Liyue, Inazuma, the Chasm, and Enkanomiya discussed so far, that leaves us with one final grouping: the domains and Spiral Abyss. Outside of the runes, which represent the written language of the ancients of Teyvat, the domains and Spiral Abyss offer us little in the order of common design themes found outside, with the exception of the four-sided figure which rests atop the entrances to these locations, as well as the occasional appearance of the Celtic knot, which also appears to be etched in the rocks of some of Khaenri'ah's stones. One point of interest, however, is the frequent use of interlocking or flowing loops which are common to nearly every ancient or lost nation of Teyvat. Each appears to have their own variant of these forms, with the domains and abyss having the simplest and cleanest design, while Khaenri'ah's include a third line which intersects them. Even Enkanomiya has an interesting take on this idea, in a more rectangular form. Hilichurl structures also display these loop designs more similar to the ones seen in the domains, but with breaks before the loops, almost as if symbolizing the third chain from the Khaenri'ah designs of their past were scrubbed clean, returning the flow of the loops to a more normalized or purified state. But perhaps the most interesting and completely unexplainable finds I've noticed come from the abyssal moonspire. Towers stretch into the sky, built in stone patterns that appear irregular, containing no signs of typical brick and mortar construction, but rather rounded edges and a satin surface that looks like something more akin to the hull of a spacecraft than a typical castle tower. With no explanation with regards to this to be made at this time, the trail goes cold, this allowing us for making any reasonable assumptions as to who created these spaces. But the oddities I just pointed out might not be the strangest observation to be made in the Moonspire. If you take a moment to inspect the floating debris overhead and then compare it to the ruins we've seen, it becomes quickly clear that the stone patterns and flowing tribal swirls match those found in Stormterror's lair. What could have caused the rubble from the kingdom of a god which desired isolation to become suspended here? Is it just a simple case of reused assets, or could it be something more? Given Hoyoverse's track record for intentional object placement and Easter eggs, the latter seems more likely. For now, I really have no explanation for this surprising and mysterious discovery. As mentioned at the start of this video, Teyvat's ruins are as varied as they are numerous. But now, hopefully you understand them in much the same way as I have come to. These ruins overflow with intrigue, with surprising and suspicious discoveries at almost every corner. So much so, that there are likely many aspects or patterns which have still gone unnoticed. Whether it's the depths of the abyss or the domains, Khaenri'ah or other ancient ruins, or even the dark tales from the chasm which speak of plagues we don't yet understand, you can be sure that I'll keep searching, looking for the proverbial smoking guns like that of the ruins Khaenri'ah built to hide the tragedy of Havria, or continuing to consider the evidence which allows us to speculate on timelines and paths of the many lost ancient nations of Teyvat. Whatever the findings, I'll keep exploring and bring them to you. And that's it for this video. What are your thoughts on the ruins of Teyvat? Do you think that Khaenri'ah got its true technological and architectural start by accepting the disenfranchised drifters of other nations, and then used their growing influence to convince others to join their nation without a god? Could this explain why their ruins are so widespread? And what do you think of the cube formations found in the chasm and their potential relationship to the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles, as well as my discovery of the rubble from Stormterror's lair floating over our heads in the abyssal moonspire? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments below. And as always, If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so that you are notified when my next video goes live. And if you want to see more, check out one of these other videos. Thanks for watching Teyvat Historia. May the 7 guide you, travelers.